A whole town lay somewhere beneath that snow. Every roof, every door, every chimney that had once breathed smoke into the morning. Gone, swallowed, pressed flat under a weight of white so deep it had erased the very streets from the face of the earth. And high above all of it, on a narrow ledge of stone, a woman stood at a window that should not have existed, and looked down at the nothing where a valley had been. She held a cup of coffee in both hands, not for the taste of it, for the warmth. Behind her, a man sat by a low fire and had not written a word in days. Some things a person cannot bring themselves to set down while they are still happening. Below her, the silence was absolute. The kind of silence that comes only after something enormous has ended. And she set down the cup. She reached for the rope, because the storm was over now, and the real work had only just begun. The morning the town vanished, a widow stood alone at a window carved from solid rock. She held a cup of coffee in both hands, not for the taste, for the warmth. Below her, where a whole town had once breathed and shouted and lived, there was nothing now, only white. A single sheet of snow, smooth and endless, swallowing every roof, every chimney, every crooked little street. The valley had been erased, not destroyed. Erased. And she stood there, watching it, in a house that should not have existed, a house that everyone had laughed at. Her name was Marin Vale. And to understand that silent morning, you have to go back. Back to the spring she first walked into that mountain town, carrying nothing but a worn leather roll of tools and a certainty that made grown men uneasy. She was 43 years old, a widow once already, a woman who had learned, the hard way, that the world had very fixed ideas about what her hands were allowed to do, because Marin was a stoneworker, and in those days, a woman was not supposed to hold a chisel. She had learned the craft as a girl, watching her father split slabs of stone as if he were reading their secret grain. He would press his palm flat against the rock, close his eyes, and somehow, he knew where it would break clean and where it would betray you. She learned to know it too, but knowing a thing and being allowed to do it, those are two very different worlds. For 20 years, she had done the work while other men signed their names to it. She had shaped the stone, and they had taken the praise. And every time she asked for more, every time she stepped forward and said, "This is mine. I built this," a door closed, sight after sight, town after town. A woman does not belong on the scaffold. A woman does not carry the tools. She heard it so many times that the words stopped stinging and started to feel like weather. Just something that happened to her over and over that she could not change, until the day she stopped waiting for permission. The town sat deep in a narrow valley out west, where the mountains rose red and sheer on either side. It was a loud place, a young place, the kind of town that believed the good times would never end. Timber buildings thrown up fast along a single crooked street, the smell of sawdust and smoke, and men working hard and drinking harder. And on both sides, those cliffs. Most people in that town looked at the cliffs the way you look at a wall. Just there. Just backdrop. Nothing more. Marin looked at them the way a musician looks at an instrument that no one else in the room knows how to play. There was a spot on the south-facing wall that caught her eye the very first morning. A natural overhang jutting out from the rock, and beneath it, a shadowed hollow, wide as a small room. She stood at the base of that cliff for nearly an hour, just looking up. Her husband stood beside her and said nothing. His name was Elias, a quiet man, a gentleman, all books and soft questions, who had married her not despite the stone under her fingernails, but because of it. He had learned over their years together to recognize the particular quality of her silence, the kind that meant she was already building something in her mind. The land office was a single cramped room with a stove burning too hot for the mild spring air. The man behind the desk looked up when she came in. He had a habit of tilting his head to one side whenever something confused him. Maren set her finger on his map, on the cliff. "That section," she said, "the hollow under the overhang. Is it claimed?" The man tilted his head. "Nobody's claimed that. Nobody claims the cliffs. There's no ore up there worth digging." "I'm not interested in ore." His head tilted further. "Then what are you interested in?" She looked at him, steady and calm. "Building a home." The silence that followed had a texture to it, the particular thickness of a man wondering if he had misheard. "You want to live on a cliff," he said slowly, "like a bird, like a woman who understands stone." There was no edge in her voice, no defense. It was simply the true answer. "What's the fee?" He named a price so small it was almost an insult. She paid it, and as she folded the receipt into her coat and turned to leave, she paused at the door, her hand resting on the frame, not for drama, just because something worth saying had come to her. "When the real winter comes," she said without turning around. "Not this year, maybe not the next. But when it comes, remember the path up the south cliff." Then she was gone. He told the story to 3 men before supper. By nightfall, it had reached every saloon in town. The woman who bought a cliff, the wife who wanted to live in a hole in the rock. They passed it around like a joke that got funnier each time. And in the back room of a certain establishment where the town's most important men gathered to drink good whiskey and admire their own good fortune. The story finally reached Gideon Thorne. Thorne owned the only bank for 50 miles, and that meant, in some quiet way, he owned nearly everyone. He was a broad man, 50 years old, hands that had never once known a single hour of hard labor. He listened to the story of the cliff woman with a slow, amused smile spreading across his face. "A hole in the wall," he repeated, savoring the words. "What does she think she's building? A cave?" The men laughed with him. Of course they did. Thorne had his own project underway. At the north end of the street, on the widest, flattest lot in the whole valley, a great house of imported timber, 3 stories tall, glass windows shipped in at enormous cost, each pane a small announcement of his wealth. A grand porch running across the entire front, meant to be seen from every corner of the town below. It would cost a fortune, and he made very sure that everyone knew the number. He wanted to be looked up at. That was the whole point of it. The next morning, he sent a man to the land office with an offer. 10 times what she had paid. Generous. More than generous. The man came back 2 hours later. The offer refused, not countered, not haggled. Simply refused. Thorne sat with that far longer than the moment seemed to deserve. It was not the money. The money meant nothing to him. It was the shape of it. In all his years of buying and selling land and men, he had rarely met a flat no from someone who owned so very little. She hadn't asked for more. She had simply said no, and gone back to her cliff. "One winter," he said that evening, to the men gathered around his table. "Give them one winter up there in whatever they're carving, and they'll come crawling down, begging for a warm room to rent." The men agreed. The subject moved on. But high above them, in the last of the fading light, the woman was already making her measurements. She pressed her palm flat against the cold face of the stone, the way her father had taught her a lifetime ago, feeling for the grain, listening to the rock, and the rock, unlike every town she had ever walked into, did not ask her to prove she belonged. It asked her only one thing: "Do you understand me?" And she did. She understood it better than she had ever understood people. Down below, the lamps of the town flickered on, one by one. Warm little squares of light, stacked inside their fragile timber boxes. So sure of themselves, so certain that the good times would last forever. Not one of them looked up. Not one of them saw the woman on the ledge, running her weathered hand across the stone, already building for a winter that none of them could yet imagine. And the mountain held its silence, the way it always had, the way stone always does. Construction on the cliff began in the first warm week of the season, and it would not stop for a long, long while. Marin worked the way a woman works when she understands, all the way down in her bones, that speed and permanence are enemies. You cannot rush stone. Stone does not care about your hurry. It has waited longer than anything you can imagine. It can wait a little longer for you to get it right. She had carried her father's chisels up that cliff path herself. The handles were worn smooth. 2 lifetimes of hands had shaped them, hers and his before her. A mason's hammer, a set of measuring rods, a level so old it had belonged to her father's father, before either of them was born. These were not keepsakes, not treasures resting quiet in a drawer. They were tools, and she meant to use every single one of them until her arms gave out. The stone of that south-facing wall was exactly what she had judged it to be from the valley floor, on the very first morning when she had stood staring up at it for an hour without moving. Fine-grained, steady, even, soft enough to carve without breaking a woman's heart over it, but firm enough to hold a ceiling above a sleeping head for 100 winters. She began with the main room, the largest space, the one that would do the most work. She cut it deep into the face of the cliff, and she let the natural overhang stand as the roof above the entrance, and she worked the chisel in long, patient strokes, reading the grain, following the stone's own logic, instead of forcing her own upon it. Where the rock wanted to break along a certain line, she let it break there. Where it resisted her, she stopped, and she listened, and she went around. That was the whole secret of it, really. Her father had told her once, when she was still small enough to sit on an overturned bucket and watch him work by the hour. "Let the tool do the work," he had said. "Slower. Let the stone teach you what it wants to be." She had spent her entire life learning that one sentence, and she was still learning it now, up on that ledge, with the whole town laughing somewhere far below her. Elias helped where he could, which turned out to be a great deal more than either of them had first believed. He mixed the mortar with a care that pleased her, and it left him aching and stiff by the middle of every day. He hauled the materials up the narrow cliff path on the back of a steady old roan horse, a patient animal, sure-footed on the ledge in a way the path absolutely demanded of him. Window frames came up in pieces, lashed to a wooden pack frame. Panes of glass came up wrapped in old horse blankets, with Elias walking directly behind the horse's hind legs the whole slow way, one hand always open, always ready to catch anything that shifted. Iron hinges, bolts, long coils of good rope, lamp fixtures wrapped in cloth, and through all of it, he kept his notes. Partly it was habit. A gentleman who had spent years teaching does not lose the reflex of writing things down. But it was more than that. He had begun to understand something, watching his wife work day after day, that what she carried in her hands existed nowhere, not in any book, not on any shelf in the wide world. The exact tilt of the overhang, angled just so, to throw the winter snow outward, away from the door, instead of letting it heap up against the entrance, the thickness of the northern wall worked out in her head, built to hold back the worst of the cold on the cruelest nights. The little spring, a thread of water seeping through a seam in the rock just above the ledge, which she caught and turned and carried down into a carved basin inside the house, so that they would never once go thirsty, even if the whole world froze solid outside their door. None of it was written anywhere. So Elias wrote it down. He wrote it the way a careful man saves seeds through a long winter, not because he needed them today, but because someday someone would. "You're thinking about things most builders never even consider," he told her one evening. They were sitting together on the ledge. The valley below was turning gold in the last of the light. The sounds of the town drifted up to them in small broken pieces. A hammer somewhere. A shout. A closing door. Marin ran a whetstone along the edge of a chisel, slow and even. "Most builders are building for right now," she said. "For this year, for the next handshake." She tested the blade against her thumb. "I'm building for the deep of winter. There's a difference." He wrote that down too. He would write down dozens of her sayings over those long months, not to steal them. She never once said them for an audience. He wrote them the way you'd press a wildflower between the pages of a heavy book. So the thing would not be lost. So the knowing itself would outlast the two of them. Down in the valley, a very different kind of building was going up. Gideon Thorne's great house rose at the north end of the street like a proclamation read aloud to a gathered crowd. 3 full stories of pale imported timber, clean, proud angles, gleaming glass that threw the afternoon sun back across the whole valley in 100 bright squares. That long porch running the entire width of the front so that no man, woman, or child could walk that street without lifting their eyes to it. And Thorne made very certain that they lifted their eyes. He walked the length of that street every single morning, slow, satisfied, the stride of a man admiring his own reflection in the whole world around him. The house was, by every measure the town understood, a triumph. It was tall. It was costly. It was impossible to overlook. And high above it, tucked into the shadow of the overhang, the woman's house was very nearly invisible. You had to know exactly where to look. You had to tilt your head at just the right angle to catch the dark line of the entrance cut into the rock. Most people never bothered. Why on earth would they? There was a mansion to admire. The talk in the town settled into a comfortable shape. The woman on the cliff became a story people told to feel a little better about their own choices. The fool who bought a rock. The wife who lived in a cave. The stubborn creature who wouldn't take good money for a bad idea. They embellished it in the saloons, each retelling a little grander, a little more foolish than the last. And no one embellished it more than Thorn, who had, after all, given her the nickname that stuck. The bird's nest, he called it. He said it the way a man says a thing he finds funnier every time it leaves his mouth. Near the end of that first long season of work, one of Thorn's men came climbing up the cliff path. Not Elias, a stranger, neatly dressed, a clerk with the soft, clean hands of a man who had never once split a stone. He had come with an offer. Maren was working at the entrance when he arrived, and she did not stop until she had finished the stroke she was in the middle of. The clerk waited, shifting his weight from foot to foot, uneasy up on that high ledge in the way that people who do not understand stone always are. Mr. Thorn would like to buy this section, the man said at last, the cliff, and whatever it is you've built into it. He named a number. It was 10 times what she had paid for the land, more money than she had held in her 2 hands in a great many years. Maren set down her chisel. She looked at the clerk, and then she looked past him, out over the whole valley, at the great pale house standing tall at the far northern end of the street. No, she said. The clerk blinked at her. He'll go higher, if that's the trouble. Mr. Thorn is a generous man. You'd walk away with far more than you ever spent. A great deal more. It isn't about the money. Then what is it about? She was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved along the ledge and lifted a loose strand of gray hair across her face, and she did not brush it away. And when she finally answered, she did not answer him. Not really. She answered something far older than that soft-handed clerk. This is the first thing I've ever built, she said slowly, that no one can take away from me before it's finished. The clerk did not understand. How could he? He had never had a thing taken. He carried the refusal back down the cliff, and he told Thorn. And Thorn sat with it far longer than a simple no should ever have required of a busy man. Because it was not about the money to him either. It was that a woman who owned almost nothing in this world had looked squarely at a small fortune and turned her back on it to go on carving a hole into a rock. That refusal lodged itself somewhere under his ribs. And it did not come loose. The first winter came gently, and that was the cruel part. That was the part that very nearly broke everything they had built. The snow fell, but it fell politely. The cold arrived, but it kept its manners about it. The old-timers had warned of hard winters in that valley. Winters that could bury a grown man where he stood and never give him back. But that first winter behaved itself, and down in the town, the people took the mild season as proof. Proof that they had been right all along. Proof that the cliff woman was exactly the fool they'd taken her for, and her hole in the rock nothing but a joke, and the whole strange business simply the stubbornness of a strange, stubborn woman who should have known her place. She wasted a whole year of her life, they said, warming their hands at their fires, carving out a cave for a winter that never even came. They laughed about it, warm and easy in the lamplight. And up on the ledge, even Elias began, very quietly, to wonder. He never said it aloud. He was far too careful for that, far too kind, but she saw it in him all the same, in the small hesitations, in the way his pen would sometimes pause over the open page and hang there, not writing. The doubt, not doubt in her. He would never let himself doubt her, but doubt in the sheer size of the thing they had done. All that labor, all those long months of aching arms and bleeding hands, for a winter that had come and gone as soft as any other. One evening, he finally spoke it aloud. The winter came, he said, and the house was warm. It was. But the winter was gentle. It never really tested anything, did it? Maren was sitting near the small hearth, turning her father's oldest chisel over and over in her hands. She did not look up from the fire. A mild winter proves nothing, she said. It proved the house is warm. It proved the house is warm in a mild winter. She set the chisel down on the stone beside her. The mild ones aren't the ones that matter, Elias. The fire cracked between them in the quiet. The mild ones just let the town go on, believing whatever it already wanted to believe. The mild ones are a kind of mercy. For them, not for us. She looked at him then, and there was something in her worn face that he did not often get to see. The one that matters hasn't come yet. He did not answer her, but later that night, when she had gone to sleep, he wrote a single line in his journal by the low light of the lamp. She is not waiting for the town to be proven wrong. She is waiting for the mountain to be honest. Then he sat a long while in the dark, listening to the gentle, lying snow. There was a night, deep in that first mild winter, when the whole truth of her finally came out. Not all at once. Maren was not a woman who spilled herself easily. She had learned, over a hard lifetime, to hold her own weight quietly. It came out slowly, the way water finds a hairline crack in stone and works it, patient and cold, until the stone finally gives. They were sitting together in the dark. The fire had burned down to embers. The whole valley lay silent beneath its polite white blanket. And Elias, gentle as he always was, asked her one small question. He asked her why it mattered so much. Why this house? Why this cliff? Why she had turned her back on a fortune to keep carving a room out of solid rock when they might have lived anywhere. In any warm timber house, in any easy town, in any comfortable valley in the world. For a long time, she did not answer him at all. And when at last she did, her voice was quiet, lower than he had ever heard it go. Every wall I ever built, she said, somebody else put their name on it. The embers shifted in the grate. Every foundation I ever laid true, every stone I ever set square and honest. A man signed the paper at the end of it. A man took the coin. A man stood in front of the finished thing and let the neighbors shake his hand and tell him what fine work he'd done. She was not bitter. That was the strangest part of it. There was no venom in her voice at all. Only something far older and far heavier than bitterness. I spent 20 years, she said, building things I was never once allowed to finish. They'd take the work the moment it got respectable, the moment it got worth claiming, right there at the very end, every single time, like clockwork. She stared into the dying fire. Do you know what that does to a person, Elias? To always, always be the hands, and never once the name. He said nothing. He knew, by then, exactly when to hold his silence and let her fill it in her own time. This house, she said, and she pressed her open palm flat against the warm stone wall beside her, the way another woman might lay her hand against the cheek of a sleeping child. This is the first thing in my whole life that no one is going to take from me before it's done. She let those words settle into the dark. When they laughed at me down in that land office, they thought they were laughing at a fool. A small breath left her, almost a laugh of her own. Almost. They were laughing at the only free thing these hands have ever built. And then the fire went dark, and the room went black. And in that blackness, Elias reached out through the dark and found her hand. He did not tell her it would all be all right. He did not hand her comfort like a spare coin from his pocket. He simply held her hand. The hand that had shaped 100 fine buildings for other men to stand in front of and be praised for. And for once in a long, hard life, that hand was not building anything at all. For once, it was only being held, and she let it be held. The second summer, she did something Elias could not begin to understand. It began on an ordinary morning. She rose before he did, the way she always rose first, and she took a heavy iron ring and her tools out onto the bare ledge. And she began to drive that iron ring deep into the living rock, not near the door, not anywhere that served the house at all, out along the empty length of the ledge, right at the very lip of the cliff, where the ground fell away into open air. She set it at a careful angle, tested it with her weight, struck it deeper, tested it once more. Then she moved a measured distance along the ledge, and she began to sink another. She did this for 3 full days. 8 iron rings when she was done, spaced at careful, even intervals along the whole length of the ledge. Each one sunk deep into the stone at a precise angle, built to hold a heavy load pulling hard and straight downward. Elias watched her from the entrance of the house, and he could make no sense of it at all. The rings led nowhere. They held nothing. They served no room, no wall, no water channel, no purpose that his eye could find anywhere. On the 3rd day, he came back up from a trip down to the valley and found her hanging her whole body weight from the last ring, testing it, trusting it with her own life before she would trust it with anything else in this world. "What are those for?" he asked her. She released the ring and stood up straight. She wiped her hands slow on the cloth at her waist, and she gave him the answer she always gave when a question had an answer too large and too heavy to say quickly. "Anchor points," she said, "for rope work." "Rope work for what?" She looked out at the 8 iron rings, spaced along the ledge like a row of silent, waiting questions. "For things," she said, "that I would rather never need them for." And she walked past him and went inside to wash her hands, and that was all she would say about it. That night, Elias wrote in his journal by the light of the low lamp, "She set 8 iron rings into the ledge today. She would not tell me why. Only rope work." And then she closed the door on the whole subject. He paused, the pen resting against the page. I have been with her long enough now to know one thing for certain. When she prepares for something, she will not name aloud. I do not need the name. I only need to trust the preparing." He wrote one more line beneath it. "She has always looked further down the road than I have. It is the thing in her that I lean on the most." Then he closed the book, and he did not ask her again. The second winter was harder than the first. Not the winter that would matter. Not yet. But harder all the same. The snow came down heavier. The cold bit deeper into everything. And down in the town, some of the easy laughter grew just a little quieter than it had been, because in the great pale house at the north end of the street, something was going wrong. The gaps between those beautiful imported boards let in far more cold than any man had planned for. The 3 tall stories proved near impossible to heat evenly. The gorgeous glass windows, so lovely in the golden autumn, turned into cold black sheets in the deep of the season, and no fire a man could build seemed able to hold the cold at bay behind them. Thorne said nothing about any of it. Of course he didn't. A man who has staked his own good name on his own good judgment does not go around advertising the evidence stacking up against him. But he felt it. On the coldest nights, sitting alone in his grand and drafty rooms, he felt the cold creep in through all that beautiful, expensive wood. And high up on the ledge, in her little hole in the rock, Marin and Elias burned barely half the wood they had set aside. The stone floor drank in the low winter sun through the south window each short day, and all through the long black night it gave that stored warmth slowly back into the room. Patient, steady, an old and honest exchange, the mountain itself breathing heat into the little house. The old roan horse stood in his small stone stable in a warmth that no timber barn had ever once given him in all his life. And the house held. "It performed better than even you predicted," Elias said to her one night, still half marveling at it. Marin only shook her head slowly. "It performed the way stone performs. Warm winter, mild winter. It means nothing at all. The house was never built for the winters that behave themselves." She was quiet a long moment, watching the low fire. "It was built for the one that won't." That second summer, she filled the deep storage passage until Elias could hardly walk through it. Dried meat, sacks of flour, salt, oil, coffee, barrel after barrel, sack after sack. All of it carried patiently up the long cliff path on the back of the steady old horse, trip after trip after trip. The raw, cold arithmetic of survival, stacked against a winter she could not yet see anywhere on the horizon, but could somehow already feel coming, the way an old wound feels a change in the weather. Elias watched the storehouse grow deeper and fuller, and he honestly did not know whether he ought to feel safe or afraid. "You're preparing for a siege," he said one afternoon, watching her roll a heavy barrel back into the deepest, coldest part of the passage. "I'm preparing for winter," she answered him, not pausing in her work. "Up in these mountains, the difference between the two is mostly a matter of opinion." And so the second winter passed, and a third long season of patient work went by, and the house grew deeper and deeper into the heart of the mountain, one careful room at a time. The town went on with its noisy business below. The bank made its loans. The silver kept coming out of the hills in a steady, bright river, and everyone went right on believing that the future was a smooth road, climbing gently and forever upward. The mansion stood tall and cold and proud at the north end of the street. The stone house sat quiet and warm and all but invisible in the face of the south cliff. 2 houses, Two different answers to the very same question. And only one of them had been built, from the very first stroke of the chisel, for the deep and honest heart of winter. High on the ledge, on the last mild evening before everything in that valley changed forever, the woman stood at her south-facing window with a cup of coffee warming her two hands. She looked down at the lamps of the town, glowing warm and yellow in their fragile little timber boxes. So certain of themselves. So sure the good times would never, ever end. And then she turned her head and looked at the 8 iron rings standing along her ledge, waiting silent in the gathering dusk, for things she would rather never need them for. The wind moved along the face of the cliff, and somewhere far behind it, out beyond the ring of dark peaks, past the edge of everything the town could see or imagine, something was gathering itself. Something patient, something enormous, something very old and very cold, something that had no intention at all of behaving. There was an old man in that town who read the weather the way Marin read stone. His name was Amos Reed. He had lived in that valley longer than anyone else still drawing breath there. He had come as a young man, chasing silver, and found just enough to keep him curious, and never quite enough to let him leave. And over the long, slow years, the mountains had grown into him, the way stone grows around a buried piece of iron, given enough time and enough winters. He did not read the sky from any book. He had no instruments, no charts, no learned words. For a single bit of it. He read it from a lifetime of mornings, from the stubborn, patient attention of a man who had watched 10,000 dawns come up over the very same ring of peaks, and had never once forgotten what any of them had meant. And on a still afternoon, near the end of that third season, old Amos Reed sat on the bench outside the general store, his hands resting quiet on his knees, and he watched the mountains, and what he saw there troubled him. It was not any one thing. That was the hard part of it. He could not have pointed a finger and named the trouble aloud. It was an accumulation, a slow weight of small wrong things, gathering in the corners of the world. The deer had come down from the high meadows early, 2 weeks early, maybe more. And they had come down in herds larger than usual, moving with a purpose that had nothing at all to do with any single cold snap in front of them. They were not running from the weather they could see. They were running from something still coming, something far off, something that reached much further ahead than any one storm. The squirrels had been working the pines with what Amos could only call a kind of anxious fury, storing, hoarding, racing, as though the little things knew something the grown men down in the street had long since forgotten how to feel. The snow line on the far peaks had dropped faster than he had watched it drop in many a year, and the afternoons had taken on a strange, held quality, a stillness, like a breath drawn in and not let out. The kind of silence that Amos, without ever being able to say quite why, had learned across a lifetime to fear. "This one's going to be different," he said quietly to the storekeeper. His voice was low, certain, the voice of a man who has long since stopped needing anybody at all to believe him. "I've watched this valley the better part of my life. I know the ordinary winters. I know just how they feel, coming down out of those peaks." He looked out at the mountains. "This one doesn't feel ordinary." Gideon Thorne happened to be passing the store just then on his way back from the bank. He caught the old man's words through the open door, and he paused in the street, and he weighed them with the tolerant, patient smile of a man who has long since decided which people in this world are worth his listening, and which are not. Old Amos sees a killing winter in every falling leaf, Thorne said to the man walking beside him, loud enough to carry back through the door. Last season he swore the sky was coming down on our heads, and we had the softest winter in living memory. He gave a low chuckle, and he kept walking, and he did not once look back. But inside the store, unseen by either man, a woman stood at the counter, waiting for her order to be tallied out. Marin Vale. And she had heard every single word. The old man's warning, drifting through the open door, and the banker's easy laughter, carrying in from the street beyond it. She said nothing. She did not turn around. She did not weigh in. She did not rise to the old man's defense, and she did not trade words with the banker. She simply paid for what she had come to buy. And then, quietly, without a flicker of expression, she added 2 more heavy sacks of flour to the order. Sacks she had not walked through that door intending to buy, and she arranged to have them set aside for the morning. That was all. She had no need to announce whose side of it she stood on. She had heard the mountains speak through the mouth of a tired old man, and unlike every other soul in that town, she believed them. That evening, up on the ledge, she unpacked the day supplies in a long silence, and then she did a thing she almost never did. She stopped, and she took a full, slow, careful count of everything in her storehouse. Every barrel, every sack, every jar of oil, every pound of salt, every ounce of coffee. She counted it all, exact, by the light of a single steady lamp. And when she had finished counting what she had, she began to count what she thought she might truly need. Not for 2, not 1 hard season for a careful woman and her gentle husband in a warm stone house, for something else, for something much larger than the 2 of them, for a possibility she had not yet spoken aloud, even to Elias. And the gap between those 2 numbers was far wider than she had let herself expect. It sat in her chest all that long evening, cold and heavy and still, like a stone that someone had reached in and placed there. On purpose, Elias found her still at it, laid into the dark. "You believe the old man," he said. It was not quite a question. "I believe the deer," she answered, not lifting her eyes from the count. "The deer have got nothing to prove to anybody. The deer don't care one way or the other what the banker thinks of them." She marked a small number on a scrap of paper. "When the animals come down early, Elias, they are not guessing. They know a thing we've simply forgotten how to hear." He watched her count on in the lamplight for a while. "How much are you preparing for?" She was quiet a long moment. "More than us," she said at last, and she would not say another word on it that night. The last stretch of that season passed as ordinary as anything. The town went about its noisy business, exactly the way it always had. The street was loud and full in the daylight hours. The bank made its loans. The silver came out of the hills in its steady, bright, endless ribbon. The good times climbed on, gentle and sure, the way every soul down there believed they always would. And up on the ledge, on one of those last easy evenings, Elias sat by the window and wrote while Marin went over her rope coils. 6 of them. The heaviest grade she had been able to lay hands on. Measured, coiled, finished at each end with the same exacting care she gave to everything her hands ever touched. She checked the knots at both ends, one, by feel. She laid them out in order near the 8 iron rings she had sunk into the ledge the summer before. Elias set down his pen, and he watched her work. "You're not going to tell me what those are for," he said. It was not quite a question either. "You already know what they're for." Her hands never once stopped moving over the heavy rope. "You've known since the summer, since I set the rings into the rock." He looked at her a long, quiet moment. Then he turned back to his journal, and he wrote one line by the low lamplight. "We are as ready now as it is possible for anyone to be." He read it back to himself, and then, just beneath it, he added one more. "I believe this, and I am trying, with everything in me, to keep believing it." Outside, far off to the west, the last light of the day caught the high peaks. They burned orange, then a deep and bloody red, then that particular bruised purple that came only when the cold was already falling fast, and the coming night would have teeth in it. Below them, the lamps of the town winked on, one by one, warm and confident in their fragile timber boxes, stacking themselves up, brave and bright, against the dark. And not a one of them, save a single gray-haired woman with her father's worn chisels and 8 iron rings and a house cut carefully into the honest heart of the stone, had taken the coming season anywhere near seriously enough. The wind came before the snow, and that was wrong. Marin knew it the instant she heard it. She had learned mountain weather down in her bones over a whole hard lifetime, and in all that time the snow had always come first, and the wind had always followed it. The wind came to drive what was already falling, to pack it hard, to throw it sideways into the world. But this wind came first. Wind arriving ahead of the snow meant the whole of it was organized in some way that ordinary weather never was. It meant the thing had gathered itself from somewhere very far off, with something almost like a will of its own, sending its scouts on ahead of it, before the great cold body of it ever arrived over the peaks. She was already awake when it started. She lay still a moment in the dark of the sleeping room, her open palm pressed flat to the warm stone wall beside the bed, reading through her hand what her ears were already telling her. The wall was warm, that deep, patient warmth the cliff had been drinking in and storing all through the long summer, giving it back now so slowly that a person only ever noticed it if they laid their skin against the rock and truly paid attention. Outside, the wind moved through the valley in a voice she had never once heard from that ledge. Not the ordinary high shriek that came tearing off the peaks. Something lower than that. Something sustained, like a single deep note held by an instrument far too large for any eye to see. She rose in the dark without lighting the lamp. She dressed by touch, moving through the familiar shape of the room the way you move through a room you have built with your own 2 hands. And she went out to the main room, to the south-facing window. The valley below her was black. The first gray hint of dawn was only just beginning to touch the eastern edge of the peaks. and the town was still nothing more than a loose scatter of orange lamp glow spilling from 100 uncurtained windows. She could read the wind by the way the smoke bent from the nearest chimney, not straight across, spiraling, caught, and doubled back on itself in the tight, cruel squeeze between the two cliff walls. That was the danger written into the very shape of that valley. She had understood it from her very first morning standing on its floor. A storm that might have been only serious out in the open country became something else entirely in a place like this, trapped, concentrated, thrown back and forth between the walls of stone until all of its cold fury gathered itself down into one narrow place. The snow began not long after. She marked the moment it started, not from any habit of keeping records, but because her father had taught her, when she was small, that knowing when a thing began told you something true about its character. Snow that began before the dawn, with this wind, at this bitter cold. After an old man's 40 years of watching had pointed straight at exactly this, that snow meant something. She stood at her window, and she watched it come down. By the middle of that first morning, the snow already lay deep across the valley floor. The street had emptied of every last soul, and the sound of the wind through the valley walls no longer gusted and fell. It had gone steady, a pressure now rather than an event, a hand pressing down on the whole world and not letting up. The old horse stood in his stone stable with his ears pinned flat back and his weight shifted hard toward the rear wall, putting as much solid rock between his warm body and the storm as any animal knew how to do. Elias came and stood beside her at the window, a cup of coffee in each of his hands. He gave her one without a single word, and the two of them watched together as the morning went from bad to something far worse than bad, slowly, steadily, with an unhurried, patient deliberateness that was somehow far more frightening than any sudden violence could ever have been. Because sudden violence spends itself. Sudden violence burns hot, and then it burns out. This had the quality of a thing that had decided, calmly, to stay. "How long?" Elias asked her at last. His voice was careful, the voice of a man who has already made his own private guess, and only wants to set it down beside hers. Her eyes never left the valley. The snow was thickening now. The far cliff wall had already begun to blur, and then to vanish behind the moving white. "Long enough," she said, "that it matters." By the end of that first long day, the drifts against the north walls of the town's buildings had climbed to the height of the lower windows. The snow itself was not yet the danger. The danger was the wind. That terrible, patient wind, and the way it packed what fell, pressing it into something far denser than loose snow had any right to become, filling in every gap beneath every eave, banking hard and high against every door in the valley, beginning the slow, quiet, patient work of transferring all its gathering weight onto roof lines that had never, ever been built to bear it. The bird's nest, that hole in the rock the whole town had laughed itself warm over, collected nothing at all at its entrance. The overhang did its patient work without any drama whatsoever, casting the falling snow outward so that it dropped clear, well in front of the doorway, instead of heaping itself up against the door. The south window held a clean, clear view, even as the whole valley below dissolved into a solid moving wall of white. The stone walls did not flex. They did not groan. They did not so much as whisper. In the little stable, the old horse worked steadily through his hay, with the deep calm of an animal in a warm place that has no earthly reason to be afraid. And down in the valley below, the town that had laughed so long and so easily had gone entirely quiet. The third day brought the first true crisis. Maren saw it from the south window. She had been reading the chimney smoke since the storm first broke, reading it the way an old doctor reads the rise and fall of a patient's breathing. Those steady gray columns rising from 100 hidden hearths, each one a small brave signal that a life still burned somewhere down there beneath all that white. And then she watched one of them stop. Not thin, not fade. Stop. The great pale house at the north end of the street. Thorne's mansion, his proclamation, his pride. Its chimney smoke, just visible when the wind thinned for a heartbeat, went from a steady gray column to nothing at all. And then, only minutes later, she watched the smoke begin to show itself again, but in all the wrong places. Thin wisps of it, leaking from the joints between the wallboards, seeping out from beneath a window frame. The unmistakable signature of smoke that has been forced to go looking for a way out. It was never, ever meant to travel. She understood it in an instant. The chimney had been packed shut. The wind, driving down at just exactly the wrong angle, with just exactly enough force behind it, had crammed the falling snow down into the flue and sealed it up tight as a cork. It was a thing that happened to tall timber houses on open valley floors. When a storm came at them just so, the fire inside would keep burning a while yet, and its smoke would find nowhere left to rise, nowhere but back down and in, filling the lower floors first, then rising, pushing whoever sheltered inside up and up into the higher rooms of their own grand and beautiful house, as surely, as patiently, as rising water fills a well. Elias came to look when she called for him. He saw exactly what she saw, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, watching that misplaced, wrong-colored smoke drift and leak against the storm-gray sky. "How many other houses will face the same thing?" he asked at last. His voice had gone flat with the effort of holding it level. "Every one that faces the wrong way," she said quietly. "Every one whose chimney stands open to that wind." She turned away from the window. "Most of them, Elias." And she went back into the storage passage, not running, not seized by any panic, but moving now with the tight, spare, gathered economy of a woman for whom the time for weighing choices had finally, fully passed. She checked the 6 coils of heavy rope. She checked all 8 of the iron rings sunk deep along the outer ledge. She checked the shovels she had gathered so quietly over 2 long autumns and stacked in the corner with their handles turned out where a cold hand could find them fast in the dark. She counted the folded blankets, one through the last. She counted the food again. Against that colder, wider arithmetic she had first worked out weeks before, alone in the lamplight, with a stone sitting heavy in her chest. And when she came back out into the main room at last, Elias was still standing at the window, still watching the smoke leak out of the great dying house at the end of the street. "We cannot go down yet," she said. Her voice carried the full and finished weight of a decision made all the way through to its bottom. "The storm is at its very worst right now. If we go down into that, we lose the cliff face 20 feet from its own base, and we die in the white, blind and freezing, and we help no living soul on this earth if we are dead on the slope. Elias turned slowly from the window, and his worn, gentle face held something she almost never saw there. Not anger, but the raw and trembling place that comes just before anger, the place where a good man's helplessness turns itself, out of sheer desperation, into fury. Because helplessness, all on its own, is simply more than a good heart can hold. "There are children down there, Marin," he said, and his voice cracked on it. "There are whole families down there. I know it. We are sitting up here with food enough for half a year. I know to the ounce what we have. And there are children in that valley who won't see the—" "If we go down into that storm right now," she said, and her voice did not rise, and it did not back away 1 inch, "then we die on that slope, and no one is saved, not a single one of them. But if we wait until it breaks, we go down with clear sight and clear footing, and strength still in our arms. And we bring up every living person these 2 cliffs will let us reach." She held his eyes with her own, and she did not look away. "Those are the only 2 roads open to us, Elias. There is no third. There is no version of this. Where going down now is the brave thing. Going down now is only the dead thing. And dead, we save nobody." He stood very still. The wind pushed hard against the deep-set window, not threatening it. The frame was cut too far back into the living rock for that, but loud. A living, howling reminder of the white dark waiting just on the far side of the warm stone. "How long?" he asked her again, and this time his voice had changed. The fury was still down inside it, but it had been pressed flat now, held down hard beneath the great weight of a truth he had not yet finished making himself accept. "Until it breaks," she said. 2 days, maybe 3. He sat down slowly in the chair by the hearth. He did not open his journal. He laid both his hands flat upon his knees, and he looked down at the warm stone floor between his feet. "Then we wait," he said, and she turned back once more to her preparations, because there was still work to be done. There was always still work to be done, and the steady doing of it was the only useful answer she had ever found to the thing that had now settled itself down into her own chest, heavy and cold at its very center, like packed snow, like a stone set down there on purpose by a careful hand that no fire on this earth could ever quite reach. Outside, the storm went on, patient, enormous, unhurried, in no hurry at all, doing precisely and only the thing the deer had known that it would do, 2 full weeks before a single man in that valley had thought to lift his eyes and look up and wonder. The waiting was the hardest thing either of them had ever done, harder than the years of carving, harder than the laughter, harder than the cold that pressed against the deep-set window all through those long, dark hours. Because waiting, when you have the strength to act and cannot use it, waiting is its own kind of storm. It wears down the soul the way the wind wears down the stone, slowly, patiently, from the inside. Elias did not open his journal again. He sat by the hearth with his hands flat on his knees, and he watched the fire, and he did not write a single word. A man of language, and language had left him. There are things a man cannot bring himself to record while they are still happening. And Marin did not stop moving. That was her way of carrying the unbearable. She kept her hands busy so her mind could not run down into the valley without her. She reorganized the storage passage. She checked the ropes again, though she had checked them twice already. She laid the shovels out, and the blankets, and the food parcels, in the exact order she would need them in when the moment finally came. She was not tidying. She was praying. She simply prayed the way stoneworkers pray, with her hands. On the 5th day, the valley floor disappeared entirely. She stood at the window in the gray early light, and she looked out at a world that no longer held a single sign that people had ever lived in it. The roof lines were gone, buried. Here and there, for a moment, when the wind thinned, the very top of a tall storefront would show itself. A strip of painted lettering, the peak of a false front, sticking up out of the white like the last mast of a sinking ship. And then the wind would close over it again, and it would be gone. The silence from below was absolute, not the soft, comfortable silence of a town asleep under snow. The other kind, the enforced silence of a place that has been erased. She kept a small fire going, steady, never large. The stone drank the heat in with its slow, patient appetite, and gave it back through the long night, so that the two of them could work without their coats, even as the white dark pressed against the walls. And on the evening of that 5th day, she read through Elias's engineering notes by the light of the low lamp, while he slept. He had begun writing again in his way, not the personal journal, something else. A cool, numbered record of how the stone walls behaved under the long cold. Observations. The kind of writing that would be useful to someone else, someday, who had never once set foot in that valley. She read it all. And here and there, in the margins, she made a small mark. Not a correction, a refinement. A place where his true and careful observation could be set down just a little more precisely, her hand beside his on the page, his writing broad and open, hers tight and small, two different instruments, playing the very same piece. And she thought, reading it, that even in the middle of something so terrible, this gentle man had found the one form that let him be of use. That was a kind of courage, too, she thought, the quiet kind, the kind that does not shout. The night of the 7th day was when it happened. She was awake, as she had been for most of the last 7 nights, in that hollow hour before the dawn when a body's restlessness climbs to its peak, and the storm seems to press hardest against the walls. She was sitting in the chair nearest the hearth, her father's oldest chisel in her hands, not working it, just holding it, the way another woman, on a hard night, might hold a book she had read 100 times, for the comfort of the weight of it. The handle fit her palm with the perfect worn fit of 30 years of use. The metal was warm from the fire-heated air. And then the sound came, without any warning at all, a deep, structural crack, not sharp, the way breaking ice is sharp, massive, the kind of sound that takes a full second just to finish happening, because the thing making it is so very large. And then a sustained collapse. The layered percussion of heavy timber failing under a weight it was never built to hold. Each floor giving way and driving down the one below it. A cascade, ending in a compression of sound so dense that it did not come to her as noise at all. It came through the stone walls as a shudder. She felt it in the floor, in the chair, in her chest. She was at the window before it had fully finished. In the black valley below, something had changed. The storm had not eased. She could still see almost nothing through the driving white, but the shape of the faint, scattered light from below, the last glow of whatever warmth still burned down there in the town's hidden hearths, was different now. There was a gap in it, a place where light had been, and now was not. The great pale house at the north end of the street, its north wall, had given way. She had known this was possible. Since the third day, when the chimney smoke had first stopped and begun to leak in all the wrong places, she had known this was possible, even likely. The north wall had been taking the full force of the driven, packed snow for 7 days and 7 nights. The load pressing down across the top of a tall 3-story timber frame under a weight like that. It was more than beautiful imported wood, well cut and cleanly joined, had ever been made to carry. She had known it, and she had not said it to Elias, because knowing it changed nothing they could do. She heard him behind her now, the creak of the bed frame, his footsteps in the dark. "What was that?" he asked. She looked at the gap in the light. "The house at the north end," she said. Her voice was level, and the flatness of it cost her far more than he could see. "Part of it. The north face has gone." He came and stood beside her. He looked down at the black valley for a long time. Neither of them spoke. They watched the storm move over the place the sound had come from, covering it, smoothing it, going on as if nothing at all had been interrupted. "People are dying down there," he said at last. His voice was quiet now, past urgency, past fury, into something older and heavier than either, into grief. "Yes," she said, and she pressed her open palm flat against the window frame. Wood, not stone, but set so deep into the rock that it carried the cliff's warmth even here. "Some of them," she said, "not all of them." The not all of them was 2 things at once. It was a fact she truly believed, based on her long, cold study of those buildings, and how they were built, and how they would fail. Some of them, she knew, would hold. Some of them stood a chance, and it was a promise she did not entirely have the right to make. She made it anyway, because he needed it, and because she needed to say it out loud, to fix it there in the dark, where the grief could not swallow it whole. Some of them, not all of them. She held on to those 4 words like a rope in the dark. The days that followed were the very hardest. Not because the storm was at its worst. By the 8th day, the snowfall had begun, at last, to ease. The gusts came less often. The great sustained pressure of the wind dropped down from its terrible peak. The storm was spending itself. But the near end of the falling snow came together with a plunge in the cold that turned everything already on the ground into iron. The packed layers compressed further still, contracting in the deepening cold, growing denser than anything Marin had seen in all her years of reading stone. She tested it on the morning of the 8th day. She stepped out to the very edge of the overhang's reach, and she set one boot down on the surface of the packed snow. Her boot did not sink. She pressed her full weight forward onto it. Nothing gave. The surface held her, as firm and true as packed earth beneath her. She came back inside, and she told Elias. He looked up from his writing. "It would hold a person's weight. It would hold 2 people with shovels." He set his pen down. Then we go. Not yet. He looked at her, and she saw the argument rising in him again. The same one from the third day. The one that lived in every good man's chest. The cold at this reading, she said, before he could speak it, means the open air will kill a person faster than the storm ever did. We would dig someone out of the ground, pull them up into that, and finish what the snow started. We'd be handing them a colder grave than the one they're in. He picked his pen up. He put it down again. When? He asked. She went to the small instrument mounted just inside the overhang. She read it. And she came back. When it climbs above a certain mark, she said, and holds there, steady, then we go, no matter what the sky is doing over our heads. Sky or no sky. We go the moment the air stops being a weapon. He nodded, slow, and he went bonk to his cool, careful notes, because it was the one useful thing left in his reach. On the 10th day, she was standing at the window when she saw the smoke change at the far east end of the valley. A thin thread of it had been rising from that quarter since about the 6th day. Barely there, a gray hair against all that white, but continuous, unbroken, a stubborn little signal that a life and a fire and a last store of fuel still held on down there. And then, in the early afternoon, that thin thread thickened, just for a moment, and then it was simply gone. No thinning, no last struggle. One moment, a thread of life against the white, and the next, nothing at all. She watched for a long time, in case it was only a flue briefly clearing, a fire being stirred, some small, ordinary thing. The smoke did not come back. Someone down at the east end of that valley had just burned the very last thing that was keeping them alive. She turned from the window and went to Elias. Tomorrow, she said, whatever the reading is, whatever the sky says, tomorrow we go down. He heard something in her voice that had not been there before. Not panic. Nothing so simple as that. The particular quality of a decision that has been pushed 1 hour past its last acceptable delay, and can be delayed no longer without a cost too great to carry. He closed his journal. I'll have the ropes ready, he said. That evening, she laid it all out. The shovels, the rope coils, the stack of blankets, the parcels of food she had prepared for people she had never met, in a house they did not yet know had saved them. She went out once more to check every anchor ring, one final time, standing on the ledge in the killing cold for exactly as long as the task required, and not one breath longer. The packed snow below caught the starlight and threw it back. The sky had cleared in part in the last hours of the day. The hard, bright stars of a deep mountain night burned overhead with the fierce clarity that comes only with the very worst of the cold. She stood on her ledge and she looked at what the valley had become. An entire town, held in suspension beneath the white, waiting. And she thought of the old man on the bench, who had read it all in the early deer and the anxious squirrels, and been laughed at for his trouble. She thought of the banker, laughing, and she thought, not with any triumph, but with a deep and settled sorrow. It did not have to be this way. None of it had to be this way. They had only to look up. Be ready by first light, she said to Elias when she came back inside. The storm let go on the 12th day. It did not end with any drama. The wind simply stopped. Somewhere in the black hours before the dawn, as if a hand that had been holding it had at last quietly opened. And the silence that followed was so complete, so total, that Marin woke from it. The absence of sound was more startling than any sound could have been, after 12 days and 12 nights of ceaseless noise. She lay still in the dark, listening to the silence, for 1 full minute. Then she got up. By the time the sun cleared the eastern peaks, she had already eaten. She had checked the instrument by the overhang. Workable. She had coiled the first rope over her shoulder and taken up a shovel in her right hand. And she had gone to Elias's journal. She had opened it to a fresh, empty page, and at the top of it, in her tight, precise hand, she had written a single line, not for records, for a marker, a line in time. This is the day it turned. She left it open on the table. Elias appeared from the sleeping room, dressed, a shovel already in his hand, his breath showing in the cold air of the main room. He looked at the open journal. He looked at her. He said nothing. She tied the first rope to the anchor ring nearest the ledge's edge. She threw the coil out over the side and watched it unroll down the face of the cliff. And then she went over. The descent was controlled, methodical, not fast because fast. On a rope over ice-filmed stone, in the thin light of dawn, was an equation with only one answer. Her boots found their purchase in the small irregularities of the cliff face, the places she had noted over 3 long years of studying this rock from above. She knew this cliff the way she knew her own hands. She reached the surface of the packed snow, and she stepped off the rope. And her boot did not sink. The surface was exactly what she had judged it to be, night after night, from her window. Compressed, crystalline, holding her weight without the faintest give. It threw the early sun back at her so hard it nearly blinded her. She had brought nothing to shield her eyes. She filed that away, without dwelling on it. A thing to remember, for next time, as though there would be a next time. She took 3 steps out from the base of the cliff, feeling the density of the pack through her boot soles, doing the calculations her mind never fully stopped doing. Elias reached the surface behind her. He looked out at the valley, at the flat white plain where a whole town had been. And his face held something that had no precedent in any moment they had ever shared before. "Where do we start?" he asked. His voice was low, as though the great silence deserved some respect. She was already scanning. The thin wisps of smoke from the hearths still burning were the obvious guides, but she was looking for something more particular than that. She was looking for the faintest thread, the subtlest breath of vapor, barely to be told apart from a cold air rising off the snow, the kind of sign that meant a fire had burned very low, that the fuel was nearly gone, that the people inside were closest of all to the edge. Her eye caught a smear of gray from the near central stretch of the buried street. "There," she said, and she started walking. Her footsteps on the packed snow made a sound like boots on hard-packed dirt, firm, decisive, leaving almost no mark at all behind her. The distance was maybe 200 feet. They crossed it in silence, the only sound the crunch of the snow beneath their weight. When they reached the place, she knelt. She pressed her palm to the surface. Then she took her shovel and probed downward, driving the handle in until it struck something solid. Not stone. The wrong depth. The wrong resistance. Wood. A roofline. She oriented herself against the map of the buried street she carried in her head. She had walked that street 100 times over 3 years. She knew exactly where the building stood beneath her. The smoke was rising from a point about 6 feet to her left, which meant the hearth was on the building's south wall, which meant that the family inside, if they had followed the plainest logic of survival, had drawn back to the room closest to the fire. She moved to the spot directly above where the hearth would be. She planted her shovel, and she began to dig. Elias dug beside her, without needing to be told a thing. They had been together long enough now that the coordination happened without any language at all. 4 feet down, her shovel struck a surface, roof decking, intact. She moved to the edge of it, went over the side, dug down along the outer wall until she was standing 8 feet below the surface. Walls of packed snow rising on 3 sides of her, and the building's cold face directly ahead. She found the window, shuttered from the inside. She knocked on the shutter with the handle of her shovel 3 times, deliberate, the rhythm of a thing meant and not accidental. And from inside, through the shutter, and the snow, and the many feet of cold, cold air, a sound. Then movement, then muffled and faint and disbelieving, a voice, alive. Elias, up on the surface above her, heard her go still. "Maren," he called down. She had her hand flat against the shutter. Her eyes were closed. "Alive," she called back up. And her level voice, just for that one word, was not quite level at all. "There's someone alive in here, Elias." And up on the surface of the buried town, in the hard, bright light of the morning after the storm, the gentle man let out a breath he felt as though he had been holding for 12 days. And down in the cold shaft she had dug with her own 2 hands, the woman they had all laughed at pressed her palm to a stranger's shutter, and felt the warmth of a living voice come through the wood. And she began at once to dig faster, because the storm was over now. And the real work, the work she had spent 3 years, and 8 iron rings, and 6 coils of rope, and a lifetime of being told no, quietly getting ready for, had finally, at last, begun. The digging took most of that first day, not because they lacked the skill for it, but because the packed snow weighed 3 times what loose snow ever should, and the walls of the shaft had to be shored constantly, or they would fall back in. The space was narrow. Only one person could dig at the bottom, while the other cleared the load from above. Maren worked the lower shaft almost entirely herself. Her whole life of chisel work turned itself now into a rhythm of the shovel, steady, patient, sustainable, because heroic got you dead in the second hour, and sustainable got the door open. And in the end, the door opened. A family came up out of the ground into the sunlight, a man and his wife and 2 young daughters, and a baby wrapped in everything the mother had been able to layer onto him, all of them alive, all of them whole. The father's fingertips touched with the early gray of frostbite where he had handled cold metal in the dark, but alive. They came up blinking, uncertain, unsteady, moving the way people move when they have been shut a long time in a small, dark place and cannot quite believe in the light. The mother came last, the baby held hard against her chest, with the fierce grip of a woman who had spent the whole storm refusing to consider any other ending. They stood on the surface of the buried town, and they looked at the flat white plain where their whole world had been, and they looked at the gray-haired woman with the shovel, and then they looked up at the cliff behind her, at the dark line of a doorway, high in the south face, at the rope hanging down, the house they had all laughed at. The eldest boy of that family, a young man of maybe 17, was the first to find his voice. He did not thank her. There was no time for thanking, and he seemed to know it. He said only 4 words. "Tell us what to do." And Marin handed him the spare shovel without a moment's hesitation. That was how it began. By the end of that first long day, they had opened 5 houses. 12 living souls had climbed the cliff path to the ledge by nightfall, guided up in the dark by Elias and a single lantern. Among them was the town's doctor, a woman found in her small stone-floored office, which had held together better than most, sitting in her coat by a nearly dead fire, her medical bag already in her lap, as if she had spent the whole 12 days simply waiting for a house call. Her name was Nora Finch, and she assessed the condition of all 11 others before she would spare a single thought for her own. She looked at Marin's deep storage passage with a professional's cold, quick eye. "How much floor space back there?" she asked, already cutting a boot away from a child's frost-bitten foot. "I need the warmest room you've got. The bad cases go there. Your main room becomes the general shelter. Your sleeping room stays yours." She did not ask permission. She had stopped asking permission for anything years before, and Marin was already moving into the passage to make the room. The shape of the ledge had changed. It had been built for 2, and now it sheltered 13, and more were coming. The arithmetic that Elias had worked out so carefully for 2 people over half a year now ran a very different way. He spent an hour that night at the table, working the numbers against the new mouths, adjusting, cutting, finding the edges of what they had. 12 days, he told her at last. At this many people, if we are careful, 12 days of food. She looked at his figures. "The snow will have settled enough in 12 days, she said, "to move people out, to reach the neighboring valley. 12 days is enough." He nodded slowly. He folded the calculations and tucked them into his journal. "There'll be more of them tomorrow." "More of them tomorrow," she agreed. The rescue grew day by day as each morning's living joined the work. By the second evening, there were 8 people out on the surface with shovels. By the third, 11. And the method refined itself around Marin, the way water finds the most efficient channel down a slope. She read the surface for the buildings beneath it, using the map of the street she carried in her head. The eldest boy and his brother ran the digging teams. Elias managed the cliff path, counting people up and down, keeping the rope rotation steady, keeping the way clear. The cold never let up. Somewhere on the second day, Marin stopped feeling her feet. Out at the toes, she noted it, without alarm, the way she'd note a crack in a stone, and she managed it by rotating up to the surface work every couple of hours to bring the feeling back. She did not tell Elias. He would have sent her up to the ledge to rest, and that would have been the wrong decision. On the 4th day after the storm broke, they reached the ruins of the great pale house. What remained above the snow was a single corner of it, the kitchen at the southwest. Marin had worked out that much in her head, from the way the house had stood and the way it had fallen. The rest was a field of broken timber and shattered glass and crumpled tin, buried under snow that had lost its grip on the frame when the north wall gave way 7 nights before. She had been thinking about this dig since the 3rd day of the storm, running the geometry of it in her head, in the long pauses, the angle of the collapse, the likely pockets of empty space left behind, the way a corner kitchen hearth would fail under a load like that. She led the team to a spot that looked exactly like every other spot on that endless white plain. No smoke, no thread of vapor, nothing at all to see. The team hesitated. "Here," she said, and her voice left no room at all for the hesitation to grow. "The southwest corner, at the foundation depth. Dig." They dug. 8 hours, the longest dig of all 4 days. At the 6th hour, 2 of the team traded out for fresher arms from the ledge above. Maren did not trade out. She worked the lower shaft herself, the discipline of 30 years turning once again into the rhythm of the shovel, reading the resistance of the packed snow the way she read stone, knowing from the texture and the density of it exactly when she was drawing close to something built by human hands. At the 8th hour, her shovel struck a thing that was not wood. It gave softly before it held. Not snow, fabric. She cleared around it carefully, the way you clear around something fragile and precious that you have been searching for a very long time. And what emerged from the packed white was the edge of a heavy wool coat, and inside that coat, a large man, hunched forward, his body curled around 2 smaller shapes pressed into the corner of the ruined kitchen wall. Gideon Thorne. He had made himself into a wall. His coat spread wide, his arms stretched out along the corner on either side of him, his whole large body a barrier, blocking what little heat his own frame could give from escaping into the cold and the dark. His 2 children were behind him, pressed into the corner, a girl and a younger boy, alive. His wife lay to his left, unconscious, her breathing shallow, but there. And Gideon Thorne lifted his head when the light broke in through the opening Maren had dug. His face was dark at the cheekbones with the deep purple-gray of serious frostbite. His lips cracked past bleeding, his eyes red-rimmed from days of cold smoke and colder air. He looked at the woman kneeling in the shaft of light above him, and his expression was not exactly relief. It was something far more complicated than relief. It was the face of a man seeing the precise physical shape of his own misjudgment, made real, made cold, made into the corner of a kitchen where his children had nearly died. Maren reached in. He took her hand, not fast, not with the grab of a drowning man, slowly, deliberately, with the grip of someone accepting a thing he understood now, far too late, that he should have understood a long, long time ago. She pulled. He came forward. He could not fully stand. His legs had been folded in that cramped crouch too long, and the cold had stiffened everything in him. So she put his weight across her own shoulders, and she walked him to the opening. The children came next. Lighter, easier to move. The wife last, carried out on the makeshift stretcher the team had learned to build. At the foot of the cliff, before the long climb up, Thorne stopped. He turned, and he looked up at the house in the south face, at the south window catching the afternoon sun, at the clean overhang above the entrance. Everything exactly as it had been before the storm ever began. His expression held something working its slow way up through 4 days of numbness and fear, toward a thing he did not yet have any words for. He looked at the rope hanging down the cliff. He looked at Marin, who was already organizing the climb, counting his family, checking the rope's condition before she would trust it with another load. She had not said a single word to him since she pulled him from the ground. She had not looked at him with satisfaction, or judgment, or the smallest flicker of vindication. She had pulled him out of the earth the way she had pulled everyone else out, with the same focused attention, the same economy of effort, the same complete absence of anything at all. That was about herself, rather than about the work. "I offered you money," Thorne said. His voice came out rough, damaged by the days of poor air. "For this ledge. For this." He stopped. He could not find the end of the sentence. Marin looked at him. For the first time since she had reached into the ground and found him curled around his children. And her face was not unkind. It was simply exact. "Save your strength for the climb," she said. "It's steeper than it looks." And she turned back to the rope. The ledge held them all through the days that followed. More than 50 souls at its fullest, in a house built for two. The stone did not care about the number. The stone had been holding the weight of the whole mountain above it since before there were people at all. 50 frightened bodies pressed against its walls meant nothing to the stone. What the stone could not manage on her behalf was the human arithmetic, the food that Elias recounted every single morning, the frostbite that Dr. Finch checked twice a day, the children who cried in the night in a space that had been carved so carefully for silence, the men who stood at the south window staring down at where their whole lives used to be, with the particular stillness of people whose futures had just been rewritten without their leave. Marin managed all of it the only way she knew how, by staying in motion. She was the first awake each morning, the last still working each night. She reorganized the storage passage 3 times in the first week to move the sickest into the warmest pockets of stone. She carved a second channel from the little spring to bring more water in, a thing she had thought about for 2 years and never needed badly enough to do until now. And Elias ran the inside of it all. The gentleman, the teacher, had finally found the one place in the world his whole life had been quietly preparing him for. He knew from all his years of study that the fairness of how a thing is shared matters just as much as how much of it there is. That people who believe the system is fair will bear real hunger far better than people who suspect the scales are tipped, even when the hunger is exactly the same. So he made his rations transparent. He posted his daily figures on a board near the entrance where the morning light struck it, so that any soul on that ledge could check the numbers for themselves. Nobody questioned them. The numbers were Elias's, which meant they were true, which, by then, everyone on that ledge understood without needing to be told. Thorne recovered in stages. Dr. Finch told him on the second day that he would keep all his fingers. She delivered it as information, not comfort, because she had read him accurately as a man who preferred hard facts to soft reassurance. His legs came back. His voice came back, rough at first, then steadier. But the man who came back was not the man the storm had buried. He was not broken. Marin would not have respected that. The complete collapse of a soul under pressure is only its own kind of failure. He was altered, the way certain stone is altered by great force, not shattered, but changed deep in its inner structure. Its response to every weight after that, different from what it had been before. He spent his first days of recovery in a quietness that was not despair. It was recalibration. Sitting against the warm inner wall, his children pressed against his side, watching the constant work of the ledge with the careful attention of a man learning a language he should have studied a lifetime ago. And on the 5th day, he got up. He went to Elias at the table with his figures, and he asked what work needed doing, not what he could pay for, not what he could fund or finance or arrange. What work needed doing with his own 2 hands. Elias looked at him a moment, weighing the question for sincerity, and finding it there. He told him the new water channel needed a second basin to keep it from overflowing when the snowmelt came hard. It was chisel work, simple enough for someone with guidance. Thorn had never once held a chisel in his life. He said as much, plainly. Elias showed him the grip, the angle, the rhythm, and Thorn worked for 2 hours on that second basin, his large hands, built for signing papers, finding the motion slowly, clumsily, the stone resisting him with the same impersonal patience it offered everyone who had never learned to read it. He broke one chisel handle. He gouged the surface twice in the wrong direction. He stopped. He looked at the damage, and he asked Elias what he had done wrong. Elias showed him, and he began again. By the end of the 2 hours, the basin was rough, crooked, but it held water, and Thorn looked at it with an expression Marin had never once seen on his face in all the years she had known of him. Not pride. She had seen his pride many times. Something more uncertain than that, more open. The face of a person meeting, for the very first time, a competence he had never troubled to build in himself. "It's not square," Marin said from across the room. Not unkindly, simply, accurately. "No," Thorn said, and he looked down at the crooked, honest little basin. "But it holds water." A pause. "That's the more important quality, isn't it?" She went back to what she had been doing. "We'll work on square later," she said, and he heard the will in it. She saw that he heard it. When the snow at last began to drop, and the world began to give the valley back, the whole town gathered in the open at the foot of the south cliff. There was nowhere else to hold it. The one intact building had become the doctor's ward. They stood on ground still patchy with snow, in the long shadow of the house they had all once laughed at. The banker spoke first, which surprised nearly everyone. They had expected him to hang back, to manage from the margins, the way powerful men so often do when their power has been publicly humbled. Instead, he walked to the center of them, and he turned to face them all. "I built the largest house in this valley," he said. His voice carried clear in the cold air. "I spent a fortune on it. I hired skilled men and the finest materials, because I believed that money spent carefully bought safety." He stopped. "I was wrong about that. In a way, that helped this town get hurt as badly as it did. And I am not going to say that once, quietly, and move past it. I want every one of you to understand that I understand it." The silence that followed was not the cold silence of people withholding their forgiveness. It was the silence of people too worn, too changed to perform any feeling they did not truly have. And then the mother, the one who had held her baby through 12 days of dark, spoke up from the back. "So what do we do now?" And that was the question Marin had been waiting for. She moved from the edge of the crowd toward its center, not the exact center. She left that space open, belonging to no one. "We don't have to rebuild the same town," she said. "We are not required to put the same buildings back in the same places, just because that's where they stood before. The valley floor is a hard place to build in this climate. We know that now. We know it with a certainty we did not have before." A few faces showed the old resistance, the instinct of people whose property, however ruined, was still recorded in the land office's books. "The cliffs on both sides of this valley are good stone," she went on. "The south face, you already know something about. You spent 11 days inside it. The north face works differently. Less winter sun, but better shelter from the spring floods. You'd have us all living in caves," a man near the front said. His voice was not hostile. It was uncertain. The voice of a man not sure whether he was arguing or asking. "I'd have you living in places," Marin said, "that are still standing a decade from now. What they look like from the outside is a separate question from whether they work. You were inside this one for 11 days. You know what it felt like. None of you froze." No one disputed that. And then the eldest boy, the one who had said, "Tell us what to do," on that first morning, the one whose arms still ached from 4 days of digging his neighbors out of the ground, raised his hand, and he asked the question that changed everything. "Will you teach us how to do what you did?" It landed differently than any of the banker's careful words had landed. It came from a boy who had earned his standing in this circle with his own 2 hands, not with property, not with money, not with history, with work. Marin looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at the whole crowd, at the faces of people who, not so many seasons ago, had laughed themselves warm over the woman who bought a cliff. The faces were different now, not humbled in the small way that word usually means. Changed. The way stone is changed under enough pressure. Its grain reorienting, its whole capacity for bearing weight shifted into new directions the original rock had never known it had. And a woman who had spent 20 years being the hands and never once the name stood in the open, in the shadow of the only thing she had ever been allowed to finish, and was asked by a whole town to teach them what she knew. "Yes," she said, "I'll teach anyone who wants to learn. The stone doesn't care whether you understood it last year. It doesn't care that you laughed or that you didn't. It only cares about one thing." She looked at them all. "What you do with it now." The years that came after were not dramatic, the way the storm had been dramatic. Drama compresses time. Ordinary life expands it, fills each day with the slow accumulation of small, good decisions whose weight you only see from a long way off. She worked. He wrote. The ledge was home. She took on students every building season. She was not patient the way teachers are patient in gentle stories. She had a directness that startled people, a habit of stopping a bad stroke halfway through, rather than letting it finish. But she never once made a soul feel foolish for not yet knowing a thing they had never had cause to learn. Ignorance was simply a condition, and learning was the cure for it. There was no shame in it anywhere, And the banker's own son, the boy who had been curled behind his father's spread coat in the corner of a dying kitchen, turned out to have an instinct for the stone that his father never possessed. Marin saw it in the first week, the way he laid his palm flat against the rock before he struck, feeling for the grain, the way she had been taught to feel for it when she was 12 years old, on an overturned bucket, watching a man she loved. She gave him the hard problems early, not as favor, as calibration. Pushing a gift toward its edge is the fastest way to grow it. And by the time he was a young man, he was the kind of stoneworker that other stoneworkers came quietly to watch. He began teaching his own students in time, the first person in that valley to teach the method, who had not learned it from Marin's own hands. She came to one of his lessons once, without announcing herself, sat on a rock at the edge of the group, watched him correct a student's chisel angle with exactly the right pressure. Firm, specific, kind. Then she stood up, and she left, without a word. He learned she had been there from one of his students, and the knowing of it sat with him differently than any praise ever could have. It was not a compliment. It was confirmation, which was the thing, he realized, he had been working toward all along, without ever quite knowing its name. Above the entrance of the house, she had a few words carved. She drew them herself, first, in pencil on the sandstone, her lettering as exact as her chisel work, and a small flat blade cut them, slow, over 3 days, deep enough that they would hold shadow in any light the day could offer. The words read, "The stone does not forgive or condemn. It endures. Build accordingly." People asked her, sometimes why accordingly? Why not something more clearly instructive? Wisely, perhaps, or with care. And her answer, when she gave one, was always brief. "Wisdom is about what you know," she would say. "Accordingly is about the relationship. I'm more interested in the relationship." That inscription outlasted everything the town had built before the storm. It outlasted the rebuilt street below. It outlasted the second generation of cliff homes that replaced the first, when growing families outgrew them. And on a quiet evening, many years on, when her gentle husband had gone before her, and her own hands had finally set down the last chisel they would ever hold, the woman who had built with stone sat at her south window one final time. The light came through the glass, gold and slow, the way it always had. The walls held their warmth, the way they always had, the way they had held it through every winter, kind and cruel alike, for more years than she cared to count. And the mountain sat around her, patient, constant, asking her, as it had asked her from the very first morning, only the one question it ever asked: "Do you understand me?" And she did. She had, all along. She was part of the rock now, and you do not leave a thing you have become a part of. Somewhere below her, in the valley, a young stoneworker was pressing a warm palm to a cold cliff face, listening for the grain, following its logic instead of forcing his own. And the sound of chisel on stone drifted up through the clear mountain air, steady, patient, unhurried, the sound of something being built, to last, the way she had taught them, the way the stone had taught her. And the mountain held its long silence, the way it always had, the way stone always does.